think that what we are experiencing, what we're going through, what we're struggling with is how to really come to terms with what it means to love, right? And I think that that is the fundamental sort of guiding principle and energy that governs all things. And so, the flip side of that in this world of duality is going to be fear. And it's an acronym, right, for false evidence appearing real. And I think that love is the guiding principle that governs all things. And so therefore, I am not only hopeful, but I'm courageously walking into the embrace of love and try to mirror that in everything that I do, day in and day out.
Henry Rock is the founder and director of City Startup Labs, an entrepreneur's academy for African American millennials that develops human, social, and economic capital within inner city America. CSL is a center of excellence for entrepreneurial competency, innovation, and leadership at the University of North Carolina at Charlotte. Henry has over 2 decades of experience in media sales, advertising, and marketing. His career includes business development and strategic planning for small, Black-owned and operated ventures. He has given a TEDxCharlotte Talk on creating a new class of African American entrepreneurs. Henry does more than inspire young men and women to live powerful and rewarding lives. He gives them the tools and shares the mindsets to make it happen. I'm Mark Paris, and this is On Life and Meaning. Henry, welcome to the show.
Good morning, and thank you.
It's great to have you. You have launched and lead an extraordinary initiative to create a new class of entrepreneurs. What is that initiative that you lead?
It's called City Startup Labs, and it's designed to, as you say, create a new class of entrepreneurs. But it's really about reimagining these young folk, particularly African American millennials, as innovators and as clearly as entrepreneurs, as folks who can be productive in starting and crafting and running new ventures.
There are different modules that make up your program, that make your program unique and different and of value to the people that you serve. Could you speak briefly about the different modules that make it unique?
Sure. So we sequence our student participants through 4 modules, and we start off with what we call cultivation, which is a 3-day intensive where we take a look at, as I like to say, who we are, why we are, where we are. And what I mean by that is when young folks are, in particular, young African Americans are trying to come to terms with what it means to be an entrepreneur, to realize your ideas and to validate those. We're looking at it through the prism of what it means to be in this society and how society sees us as African Americans, and how do you navigate that. That's one part of it. The other part of it is really more of a human concern, and that tends to be what gets in the way of us realizing our possibilities and our dreams and so forth. And typically that what gets in the way is us. And so what we try to do is deconstruct some of the thinking, the belief systems, the conditioning that tends to thwart our dreams and to see those come to fruition. We sequence from that into what we call the preparation module. And that is where we take a look at the entrepreneurial mindset. We do a lot of critical thinking exercises. We have introduced design thinking or human-centered design into that. We look at experiential learning. We do a lot of teamwork there. And the emphasis is on sort of orienting one to come to terms with this huge responsibility that they're about to take on in becoming an entrepreneur. It's more than a notion. A lot of people have, some fanciful ideas about it. So we want to kind of set the record straight, so to speak, and get them really clear-eyed about this role that they're about to take on, and think in terms of being a problem solver, because fundamentally that's what entrepreneurs are. And then from there we go into what we call the education module, and that's where we roll up our sleeves and really get down to the brass tacks of what it takes to research and plan and ultimately launch a new venture, or if you have an existing business, to refine it and point it in a direction where it can get some traction. And last but not least, we have the demonstration module, and that is fundamentally the incubation portion of the program. So the first three modules, if you will, represent the accelerator portion. And the last module is really about taking that great idea that you have and ultimately bringing it to market, either in the form of a prototype or a minimal viable product, as we like to say, really positioning it such that it's ready to launch.
What are the nuts and bolts of the program? How long does it last? How many students are in a cohort? And how many cohorts have you had?
The program is designed to accommodate up to 25 students, and we've had anywhere from 17 up to actually 24, 25. The program runs, and it's been redesigned a bit, but when we first started, and we've done 3 cohorts, and as I said earlier, they were specifically targeted to young black men, so they were ages 18 to 34, and we've done 3 of those cohorts thus far, but they've ranged up to roughly 9 months. And that's a bit long, so the bulk of that 9 months or 6 months of that was on the incubation and or within the demonstration module. So we're compacting this a bit more and shrinking it down to 6 months. And so 3 of those months will be where they are incubating as opposed to 6. And this upcoming class, we're about to have a new cohort in September. We're casting a wider net to include women, and we're also looking for folks who are makers and designers and creatives, not just people who want to launch the next unicorn, but people who are in the midst of making something, doing something, either product, service, and they want to develop some real business acumen around that.
The program you described is very robust. Can you talk a little bit about where the curriculum came from and how it was developed and how you have shaped it?
So originally I was using Kauffman Foundation, which is the largest advocate and researcher of entrepreneurial activity in the country, and they're based out of Kansas City. So I was using a couple of their programs for curricula. I really didn't want to go through the process of actually writing a curriculum. This was my first experience actually at conducting any classes, so the less of that I had to do, the better. And so I made use of some of their programmatic materials in the first cohort. I realized then that it was not, in spite of their best intentions, as culturally relevant to the students that I was dealing with. So I jumped in and started modifying and really called on a fair amount of material that is in the public domain, particularly business model generation, which is sort of fostered and advocated by a fellow by the name of Steve Blank out of Stanford. And he is also what I would call, many other people probably call him this as well, the godfather of the lean startup movement. So I saw some parallels between what they were doing with the lean startup and this whole issue around experiential learning, and saw a way in which we could sort of segue what we were dealing with experiential learning right into lean startup principles. And so, there's a lot of augmentation of all of that so that it would be relevant. We were also using Barry Gordy's autobiography, To Be Loved, as a case study, because Barry Gordy was going through a lot of the challenges that, many decades ago, but nevertheless, very, very similar challenges that a lot of the young men were going through. So it was relevant material. They embraced it enthusiastically and so forth. So a lot of this has been developed, kind of cobbled together from things that I've experienced, as well as I said, stuff that's in the public domain.
What are some of those mindsets and challenges that you address for the cohort that you are speaking to culturally?
It's tough for a young black man in particular, and I can speak directly to this because at one point I was a young black man, so I can identify completely. But it's really tough to go through a day without being reminded, in one respect or another, of who you are perceived to be and how that affects you psychologically. Even if it's pushed to the recesses of your mind, it still affects you, and it can affect you not just psychologically but physiologically. And this has been pointed out in a fair amount of work that has been done on this subject. And so I don't want any of the sort of societal issues that these guys have to confront be something that is an impediment to them realizing their true worth and human capital, their real true human capital, and what that ultimately can mean, not only for them and their families and their community, but also for our country as well. I think we need to have all hands on deck, all shoulders to the plow, and I want them to see themselves as real contributors to their own development and their own sense of self-worth, and then also contributors to this society.
You've been doing this for 3 years, working with these young men, sharing these ideas, inspiring them, creating a path forward for them. What has surprised you about the experience?
There have been any number of the guys that have come through the program that are doing really amazing things, and I'm proud of that. In many cases, even more so than I'm proud of those that have actually launched companies. In some respects, it was intended to have this kind of impact, but it was, the results were somewhat unintended also. So, I've been surprised at that. I've been surprised at in hearing back from people who, started in 2014 and reached out to me this year talking about the impact that the program has had on them and how they use it day in and day out, some of the principles and the precepts and so forth, and how it's affected their lives. So that's really, really moved me. It's what continues to motivate me to do this work.
So you are underwritten by foundations and grantors, and when they check in with you and they say, Henry, how are things going? What do you report back?
We have 5 businesses up and running that are revenue positive. We've had a graduation rate of close to 80%. We have folks that have a much better sense of what it means to be an entrepreneur. We have folks that have come away understanding the impact of this in terms of economic or the economic impact that this kind of education can have on Black communities. So, I think that, and this is not necessarily anecdotal, we've done some assessments around this. Going forward, though, what I'm really looking to do, and we've been underwritten by the Ventureprise Fund, I want to look at how this education actually really does move the needle, particularly here in the Charlotte area, where we're coming to terms with, on one hand, who we are as an entrepreneurial city, and then also, on the other hand, trying to deal with this question around socioeconomic mobility. So we want to see whether or not this work that we're in the midst of is actually having an effect. So we want to sort of measure that and assess that over a period of time.
One of the challenges of leadership is that you have to bring vision and energy to work that is not a priority for other people. And you have to do it in such a way that inspires others to be as invested as you are. That is a huge burden of leadership. What sustains you to continue the work?
Well, I alluded to it a little while ago, and in that, I see and I not just see, but I also hear from prior participants and the effect that this work has had on them and what it has meant to them. And also what's been pretty interesting too is to see how friendships have formed as a result of this kind of mashing up of people that otherwise didn't know each other. The other thing that I think is really important is, we're really about building three classes of assets. So I mentioned human capital before. That's what we do through the education, technical assistance, and so forth. And it shows up in employment, which is an important thing, particularly here for our corporate citizenry. But also there's the social capital. So we try to seed that with these accountability partners and business coaches and advisors and the like. But someone who heretofore had no clue as to the fact that there is a entrepreneurial ecosystem that exists here, but now they're part of it. Now they're plugged into it. That's gratifying. That's the thing that also keeps me motivated in this, and being able to see how that shows up and then how that ultimately unfolds in someone's life. And then there's lastly the economic capital. And that is not in the most obvious terms, all right? So there's, yes, creating your own bank account and looking after your family, but also starting to think about intergenerational wealth. It's also about showing up as a role model, a different kind of role model. Not the athlete, not the rapper, not the gangbanger or whatever, which is the typical portrayal of a lot of these young Black folk. And they can get caught in that vortex as well. But if they show up as a different kind of role model, hey, you can do what I've done in terms of crafting a business and so forth. As I like to say, it's not just about the cheddar, but it's about making things better. So that's one of my mantras that these folks hear, and that also is a very powerful motivator for me to continue to do this work.
Henry, you came to this work later in life through a winding path. You grew up in New Jersey. What was your life like growing up?
Well, actually, I grew up in a middle class background. My father was an engineer after having been a pilot, Air Force pilot, first 10, 12 years of his adult life, and my mother was a school teacher. And I come from a family on both sides of my family. I come from a really interesting family history that parallels the arc of African American history, and really almost directly, from folks that were born into slavery, who went to college. My great-grandmother was in the first graduating class of Spelman, and her husband was at Tuskegee. In fact, when it was being built, when Booker T. Washington was there and so forth. And my father and his brothers were all aviators, one of which was a Tuskegee Airman. And the notion of uplifting the race was really part of who we were. And education was really stressed. What was interesting, though, is that I kind of defied that in many respects. So much to the chagrin of my family, I didn't finish college. I figured that I would go a different route, and I did. But nevertheless, the principles that I learned, the values that I learned, have sustained me, and in part, this is what I'm looking to provide some of these young folks that I'm working with.
I believe you grew up in the late 60s and 70s, and that was a particularly vibrant time in American history, and particularly in civil rights and in race relations. And you came from a family that was middle class, educated, saw a path towards integration into society, and yet as a young man you had a different kind of consciousness. Can you talk more about that?
Right. So actually I was born in the 50s, early 50s, and so right in the midst of the beginning of the civil rights movement, or the early days of the civil rights movement. As a matter of fact, my father was there during the Montgomery bus boycott because he was going through flight instructor training in Montgomery and was shepherding a lot of the folks that needed rides and so forth back and forth to work. And so nevertheless, that, came up on the heels of the civil rights movement. And so it was during that period that I got introduced to what's called the cultural nationalist movement, which was the proponents of that were Amiri Baraka and Ron Karenga. So Amiri Baraka was running an organization in Newark called the Committee for Unified Newark. And it was part of a larger group called Black Community Development and Defense, or BCD. So I was affiliated with that, and that was, right in the midst of the Black Power movement. So when you think of cultural nationalism, if you've heard of Kwanzaa, the holiday Kwanzaa, that sort of came as a result of that. If you saw folks wearing dashikis and all kinds of stuff, that was by virtue of cultural nationalism to a great extent. So I was smitten by that, and was very much in high school through my little bit of time in college, was very much part of trying to move what I felt were important issues forward as it related to our empowerment.
Cultural nationalism, is it a euphemism in any way for Black nationalism? Is it different? How would you explain that?
With cultural nationalism, and by the way, this is somewhat of an undertold story, and interestingly enough, I wanted to do a documentary about this before Baraka had passed away. We often think about the Black Panthers and as the sort of the face of Black nationalism, and maybe prior to that you would think of Stokely Carmichael or SNCC as at the forefront of Black nationalism, and even before then, Malcolm X, perhaps being the father of Black nationalism. So there was I would say that in some respects the distinction, although it's kind of fuzzy, Black nationalism really has more to do with how we move things along politically. What are we doing to change the social circumstances And is there a political way in which that can be engaged, or how can we press affect the social levers, or the political levers rather, in order to create this social change? And so one of the things that was an outgrowth of Black nationalism was the Congress of African Peoples, which was convened in Gary, Indiana. There was a spate of Black mayors that came into office in Newark, New Jersey. Ken Gibson was the first Black mayor there. A lot of that had to do with the Black nationalist movement. Cultural nationalism, on the other hand, really had more to do with identifying who we are as an African people, right? So embracing our, because we don't typically know where we came from unless we do some sort of genealogical study. As African Americans, we came from various parts of the continent, or at least our ancestors did. And so being able to find out where we were or where we came from, it's a difficult process. But if we could just look at the continent of Africa and identify with that as our motherland, and all of those accoutrements that come with that. So, the wearing of the dashikis, the wearing of natural hair, maybe adopting African names and so forth. And you see, some of that kind of showing up in how Black folks have different kind of sounding names and so forth. It's our attempt to have a touchstone with who we were and try to identify who we are.
Did you draw that distinction for yourself at that time between identifying yourself as a Black nationalist versus a cultural nationalist?
I don't want to draw as sharp a line here as it sounds. One lends itself to the other in some respects, but what we often find is that those who embrace Black nationalism, and even that is kind of a loaded term in some respects. What does it mean? You're talking about creating a nation. There are some folks that had that notion. We created a nation, carved that out of some southern states. But it really had more to do, as I said earlier, with the social political efforts. And you could be a cultural nationalist. In other words, you could identify yourself with, with your Africanness, and be also about moving things forward socially and politically. And that's precisely what happened with the Committee for a Unified Newark. So if it were not for the efforts of those cultural nationalists working on to get Ken Gibson into office, he would not have gotten in office, right? So there was, and then also Baraka ultimately moved away from, the cultural piece and moved into embracing, actually embraced communism at one point. So,
what is the difference in your mind between Black nationalism and white nationalism?
From the point of view of Black nationalism, I see it as a reaction to the conditions that we as African Americans have experienced since we've been here. It has sort of culminated in this desire to protect ourselves, especially when you consider what we thought that integration might usher in for us. In other words, this would provide us with more opportunity, more access to the American dream, right? The dream that we had a fundamental role in playing, but have not experienced in full measure, or maybe even in half or quarter measure, right? And so it is a reaction to that. It is a reaction to the, and you have to understand the context in which this movement, if you will, came out of, right? So I would say that the father of black nationalism, I mean, you could go back to Marcus Garvey, but let's make it more contemporary, and we can talk about Malcolm X. And Malcolm X was saying to black folks, and it resonated with a whole lot of black folk, that we needed to do for self. We needed to provide for self. We needed to protect self. We needed to support self, right? Because others were showing that they were not willing to do that, all right? And do that in a way that we could count on day in and day out. And that's not to say that good-natured white folks who put their lives on the line in supporting this as, I mean, we could, talk about any number of white folks that have been on the front lines with us. So it is not necessarily about that, but when we're facing the kind of systemic issues that we've been up against, there is this need to feel almost sort of insular, right? And so I think black nationalism was in some respects, a response to that, a defensive kind of posture that we felt was necessary to take. Now, it also allowed for others who had, less noble motives to use it as a platform to do stuff that, wasn't consistent with, what I think the people who were kind of at the forefront of this movement had in mind, much like with what's going on with Black Lives Matter today, right? I mean, the fact that we even have to say Black Lives Matter today is an indictment on where we stand as a country, right? Why would we even have to say that if all lives really did matter, right? So, but yet, nevertheless, some people use the canopy of Black Lives Matter as a way for them to do some things that are really inconsistent with where the founders and the leaders of that movement are about. And that's the same thing. I think the same thing is true there. So when we look at white nationalism, the white nationalism is really more about maintaining power at the expense of, in my estimation, at the expense of others who are not white, right? It is not necessarily about defending themselves and supporting themselves necessarily in a way that is an answer to the kinds of egregious things that we as a people, as black folk, have experienced, but rather it is a way in which to reinforce those things that have black folks in the conditions and the positions that they're currently in, and others as well. So I think it is it has for me at least, it has a more offensive and sort of negative posture. And I could see how white folks would say the same thing about when they hear black nationalism, that it strikes that chord for them. But I think that if you understand why we felt the need for that, then you could see that there is a very distinct difference and a sharp difference between the two.
Who were you as a young man? How would people have described young Henry Rock?
They would say that I was, at least I think they would say that I was curious, that an imaginative, playful, a bit of a prankster, and fun guy to be around, and a fun guy to have as part of your crew, so to speak, right?
Do you still see yourself in that way now?
I do, very much so.
Henry, you studied economics at Rutgers and later marketing at the Keller Graduate School of Business. Why did you choose those fields?
And I should say for the record that I don't have a degree. Not necessarily proud of it, but and wouldn't advise it as such. But I think that a lot of folks, a lot of young people particularly today, given the price of higher ed, are challenged with, does it make sense for me to go down this path? And so I was one of those guys, right? And as I said, I came from a family of educated folks. But I chose economics initially because I was thinking about how economic development could be. I wanted to rather have a better understanding of economic development as it related to Black communities, and wanted to see whether or not there was a role as an economist that I could play in that. And I was also, I'd taken some urban studies classes and so forth, but I ultimately moved away from that and chose media as a career.
What was the work that you did in media?
So I worked with, and I guess all of this sounds like I'm just blackety black, but I worked in Black media, right? and originally I actually worked in television, in doing production and technical work, but I was working for a Black show, in New Jersey. Actually, I started in public television in New York and worked for a very, very interesting show called The 51st State. But then, sort of found my way into working with this Black show down in Trenton, New Jersey, and then also doing a lot of news and documentary work in that period, and then transitioned into another sort of phase of media, and that was selling advertising. And to be honest with you, it was not necessarily my first choice to go to work for a Black company. I just got turned down so many times in my interviewing process with white companies that I had an opportunity to work with a Black company, and happened to have known the owner of the firm, and that was my entree into selling advertising. And we were not just selling local advertising, we were selling national advertising. So I had a chance to work with major national brands. Ultimately went on to work with the Johnson Publishing Company. So they published Ebony and Jet magazine. I was working with Jet magazine, and furthered my understanding of media and marketing and advertising at that point. And then back to Philadelphia, working with another Black publication and a fellow by the name of Reagan Henry, who was was the owner of the largest number of radio stations and TV stations by an African American in the country, and also had this newspaper that he had started as well that preceded USA Today as the first national newspaper in the country. So I had the real wonderful opportunity to work with him, and ultimately became publisher of that. However, I have to say that there were a number of opportunities where I went out to try to get jobs with Time Inc. or Condé Nast and on, right? And went through close to 100 interviews and took no takers. One time where I would get close, I'd be like maybe be down to 2 candidates, never got the job. One time with Time, I was looking to get a job with Life magazine, was very close to getting that job, was told by the New York sales manager, and not to repeat this, so I'm now repeating it all these years later, but I was told that the advertising director didn't want to have another Black man on his staff, so that was the reason why I didn't get that job.
What conclusions did you draw?
I think that in some respects it was sort of part and parcel of what I was dealing with in trying to sell the value of the Black consumer to advertising agencies and these major marketers. There was always an uphill struggle in trying to convince folks that yes, black folks had value as consumers, right? And in fact, in many cases, we'd be the difference between profit and loss for a brand, and yet a new crop of eager young white folk, I would have to, go through this same process of trying to convince them of that value. So when I went to try to toss my hat into the ring and get a job with some of these general market media firms, I just saw it really as a continuation of what I was dealing with on the other side of the ledger, right? So it was, no different. But what I have to say that is a very interesting kind of thing that took place during that period. First of all, I really had the great opportunity to be working at what I would call the heyday of black media and black advertising agencies. So tens of thousands of people were in the employ of these companies, large and small. And we were really, as I kind of alluded to earlier with this whole black nationalism piece, we were doing for self. Now, yes, we had to go to Ford or Coca-Cola to get advertising dollars, but the rationale there was, hey, listen, we're using your product, so you ought to invite us to buy. So that was an amazing period, the likes of which we probably will never see again. So there was a certain pride in working with these companies, all right? But yet you also wanted to test your value at, like in the big leagues, you know what I mean? And so this was, you've gone from, Negro ball to the big leagues. And the big leagues didn't necessarily want to accept you. And this was not just true of my experience, but, many of my colleagues. Others had different experiences, but those were mine. And I think that what that did for me and others, even those that worked with white companies, where we were suited up and tied down, we always had in some cases in the back of our mind, some cases very much in the forefront, that we were black folk in a white world, right? And that we had to navigate this world in a very, very shrewd, eyes wide open kind of manner. And in part, this is why I feel it's so important that I do the work that I'm doing. I do this address that from time to time which I call context and continuity. So the context piece is, so why are we in this economic condition that we find ourselves in, such that, as the Institute of Policy Studies noted, it would take 228 years for us, if all things remained the same in terms of, how we're tracking, it would take 228 years for black families to catch up with white families in terms of familial wealth, right? And that has been a condition of a system that has been put in place, that has been reinforced, that shows up over and over and over again, right? And so we need to understand that as a context, right? For, as I said earlier, this is why we are where we are, right? And it's just the reality, so we have to deal with it, okay? But the continuity piece really has to do with the fact that we come from, nevertheless, a long line of business owners and, inventors and investors and entrepreneurs, even before that term was popular, dating back to before the founding of the country. So these folks that come through City Startup Labs are part of that continuity, are part of that legacy, if they step up and do the work.
There came a time in your career where you made a dramatic change, and you relocated, and you had this idea, and you changed your life. What was the impetus, the motivation for it, and how did it come about?
Well, I moved here to Charlotte, actually, to marry an old beloved of mine who I've known for 30 years, and that was the reason why Charlotte was even on the map for me, because it was not on my radar at all. But, I talk about the importance of spirit playing a role in allowing for spirit to show up, and there was no way I could connect all these dots, to be honest with you. It wasn't when I was a young boy, curious and inventive and all that, there was no way that I could see myself doing what I'm doing now. All right. So this is the hand that spirit plays. And all I have to do is just continue to kind of do the work. So this work, kind of what brought me to this is really, my life experience in a lot of respects. I mean, I had an aha moment. Yeah, I had an aha moment. There was a time back in the mid-aughts, I would say around 2006, I conceptualized this sort of boot camp for ex-offenders and former gang members, and I was looking to see if I could get some traction with that with the incoming Cory Booker administration. He was becoming mayor of Newark, and didn't get much traction there. I got no traction, actually, with it. And as fate would have it, there was another twist and a turn in New York and so forth. But then I came here to Charlotte with a very different kind of idea, and was able to get some traction. And as a matter of fact, launched this pilot in collaboration with the Urban League here, and been kind of off to the races since then. Could not have mapped that out if my life depended upon it. And yet my life has depended upon all of this stuff that has led to this, and I think it's for me it's been a very fascinating kind of journey, and to really reflect upon how I got here. I want my I say my students, but the folks that go through City Startup Labs to also have this sense of how do you create a space for spirit to show up and occupy that space, and how do you continue to stay on point, stay true to your mission, but not clench the steering wheel and try to navigate every single turn along the way. You have to sort of relinquish the navigation to the Grand Navigator, and just make sure that you're pointed in the right direction. Where do you want to go, and then be about going there, but then let go of the wheel.
Are you hopeful?
I'm hopeful because at the, sort of net with all of this is love, right? And I think that what we are experiencing, what we're going through, what we're struggling with is how to really come to terms with what it means to love, right? And I think that is the fundamental sort of guiding principle and energy that governs all things. And so, the flip side of that in this world of duality is going to be fear. And it's an acronym, right, for false evidence appearing real. And I think that love is the guiding principle that governs all things. And so therefore, I am not only hopeful, but I'm courageously walking into the embrace of love. and try to mirror that in everything that I do, day in and day out.
Thank you, Henry.
Thank you so much.
Henry Rock is the founder and director of City Startup Labs, an entrepreneurs academy for African American men and women. His work includes plans to help previously incarcerated persons of all backgrounds to reincorporate into society and to thrive as returning citizens. And now a personal word. The discussion you heard was the second one I had with Henry Rock. The first one did not record. This is what you did not hear about race and discrimination. I asked him if City Startup Labs only accepted African Americans into the program. He said yes. I asked him if he would turn away someone interested in CSL who was not black. He said he might mentor the person personally, but that the program itself was for young black men and women. I asked if he would turn away other people of color, like Indians and Asians and persons from the Middle East. He said he objected to the phrase people of color because he stopped being colored a long time ago. I asked Henry about terms he had used to describe himself, including being race conscious, grounded in his blackness, a black nationalist, and being unapologetically black. He said all of that was true. I asked if a funder or underwriter of CSL ever expressed concern that CSL was exclusively for African Americans. Henry said no one had ever asked him that question. I asked him if his exercise of authority limiting access and opportunity to others based on a person's skin color troubled him. He said it did not. He said the program was doing for self, the self of the black community, and that CSL was for black people. The exchange might sound confrontational. It was not. It was part of the flow of an hour-long discussion about his work and life that in tone was very similar to the one you just heard, although some of it was pointed. After Henry left my home and I checked the computer, I realized nothing recorded, not a sound. I had forgotten to turn on the microphones I had set up on my kitchen table. I closed my eyes and grimaced. It was not the first time I screwed up the technical side of this podcast. I'm not very smart when it comes to pressing buttons. Paper and pencil and words, yes. Software and hardware and keyboard commands, not so much. When I realized I did not have a word on tape, or no audio converted to zeros and ones as it were, I apologized to Henry and asked if we could give it another go. He generously agreed to come by my home a week later to record again. In the days in between, I thought a lot about his position that City Startup Labs was only for black folk, especially in light of recent events of white nationalists and neo-Nazis marching in the streets and what we owe each other in society. Could we get past race division if his program divided the races? I prepared to push him harder on his thinking in a way a friend of mine once described as warm and cheery confrontation. That can be me sometimes in a discussion, warm and cheery confrontation. Here's the thing you should understand about me and conversations about race. I grew up in Queens, New York in the early 1970s. My family lived in apartment buildings in ethnically diverse and rising socioeconomic neighborhoods from Lefrak City to Rego Park. My closest friends were Takashi Tanimura, Japanese American, Robert Narva, could have been Scandinavian American, and Christopher Carr, African American. I was the boy from the Portuguese-speaking, half-Jewish, half-Catholic immigrant family from Brazil. My classmates at PS 139 were Italian and Irish and Jewish and black and Puerto Rican. That was New York. The photos from my birthdays when I was 8, 9, and 10 years old all look like they were taken at the United Nations. Growing up, I was far more relaxed with people of color, a phrase we never used or heard of back then, than with wealthy white suburban Protestants who were completely alien to me. There is more to the story about me growing up with people different than me, living overseas, moving to Miami, being with all sorts of folk in all sorts of neighborhoods, But that's a story for another day. One result of it all is I have talked and explored and have had conversations about race with all sorts of folk my entire life. Discussions that I have had about race are real and nuanced and pointed and sometimes very funny. Yes, I go there. I am sensitive to language about race because words have historical weight and words convey meaning and intent that matter. But I don't fake what I think or feel or use politically magic terms to pose or posture. I seek to understand, I arrive at my own conclusions, I have the conviction of what I think, and I don't pull any punches. And I believe that is appreciated by the people with whom I speak. I assess people on their integrity and their values and their work ethic and compassion and their humanity, and that's it. There are folks I like and folks I don't like, and folks who like me and who don't like me. All of which brings me back to my second conversation with Henry. On the morning of his second visit to my home, it struck me that I would not question him along the lines I had previously. Maybe that's what you want to hear, for me to intellectually spar with my guests. Maybe that's the fire and energy and pop that you have an appetite for and that you expect of me, especially those of you who know me, waiting for me to be Socratic or contrarian, as I often am with friends over coffee or with my students in the classroom, to bring all the verve and wit and whatever incisive intellect I might have to this podcast. And maybe I will as I get better and more relaxed with having a microphone in front of me. And maybe I should to entertain and reveal more of who I am and to grow an audience. But not in this instance. Not in this instance for two reasons. One, I've made a choice on this show, at least so far, to ask simple and direct questions of my guests and to get out of the way. I want to give my guests the room to reveal themselves and the complexity of who they are and to discuss deep and profound questions in a respectful and thoughtful way. And two, how Henry chooses to respond to 400 years of enslavement, segregation, discrimination, and oppression that has dismantled his community is his choice. The space and education he is providing young black men and women to learn and realize their dreams in a society that otherwise lines up everything against them calls for us to listen carefully, to understand, and to support him and his work if we so choose. He is doing his work with love to uplift the next generation of his community and to integrate them into society. That is something to honor. The only moral judgment we should have are for those who wish to divide society based on hate. And so the conversation you heard with Henry. Thanks for listening. This is Mark Paris, and you've been listening to On Life and Meaning. Thank you to my partners Andy Go, producer of the show, and to Chris Curriton, art and media director. This is how you can help. Please write a review on iTunes. It helps us grow our audience. Follow us on Facebook. We'd love to hear what you think about the show. And become a patron. We are on Patreon, a crowdsourcing platform that allows you to support what you value. Visit us also on our website, onlifeandmeaning.com. Thank you for listening.